Good afternoon to dear colleagues, friends, audience, and good morning to dear Professor Karen DeFort. Welcome everyone to join today's lecture. As you may know, Spiritual Humanism series lectures are hosted by Institute for Advanced Humanistic Studies at Peking University. I'm Qiu Chuyuan, Assistant Researcher in IAHS, as well as lecturer in Beijing University of Posts and Telecommunications. It's my great honor to be today's moderator. At first, I would like to introduce you to some information about IAHS and the Spiritual Humanism series lectures. IAHS has been promoted academic research of international and creative significance to promote interdisciplinary collaboration within humanities, between the humanities and the social sciences, and between the humanities and the natural sciences, to deepen the self-reflexivity of Chinese traditional culture, and to realize its creative developments and transformations since its establishment in 2010, and 2020 marks its first decade. Professor Du Weiming, the founding director of IAHS, has promoted spiritual humanism as offering a counterbalance to the inadequacy of our modern secular era to provide a proper compass for human flourishing. The Spiritual Humanism online lecture series aims to provide a platform for dialogues among international scholars to explore a new form of dialogical wisdom. Today, we are so glad to invite Professor Karen DeFort on this lecture. Karen is professor of sinology at the University of Leuven in Belgium. Her primary field of interest is early Chinese thought. She did lots of marvelous studies on early Chinese thinkers, such as 墨子、庄子、墨翟、何冠子、杨朱, etc. Today's lecture is about her secondary field of interest, which is the modern period where early Chinese thought was interpreted and its influence on our current understanding of the master's texts. I'm quite lucky to hear Karen twice before. The first time was in 2017. She gave the keynote speech on SACP conference about how to name or not to name in early Chinese philosophy. The second time was on the 24th World Congress of Philosophy in 2018. At that time, Karen gave a speech on the Mencius Forum in Chinese, which is so impressive. Her vision and the studies have enriched our understanding of Chinese thought, both in the East and the West. Today, Professor Karen DeFort will present her newest study about the modern notion of 证明, or correction of names, in order to trace 证明's historical emergence at the turn of the 20th century. She will discuss when precisely did 证明 become an independent topic of scholarly interest? How was it discussed? How did this differ from the past? And what the earliest lines of modern interpretation? Now, let's welcome Professor Karen DeFort to present her intriguing thought. Karen, it's your turn now.
Okay. Thanks a lot. So can you see it? Is it okay?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. First of all, I want to thank you for this very kind invitation. Chu-Yuan, also thank you for organizing it, for hosting it, but also Professor Huang, and of course also Professor Du Weiming and everybody who is involved in this. The title of my topic is Unfreezing and Untangling the Modern Notion of 证明, from Kang Youwei to Hu Shi. what I will not do here is join the debates about the philosophical interpretation of Zhengming. This will not be what I will do, but I will try to reflect upon them. So there is a difference between joining the debate and adding my theory and my interpretation, and reflect upon the topic itself. So I will not add anything more to debates that have been going on. And to show what it means, this reflection, I want to refer to an insight that was presented by Hannah Arendt in actually the last book that she wrote. And the book was called Thinking. It was part of a larger project, but she was not able to finish the whole project. And in this book, she tries to present a type of thinking that I want to follow here. And I start with a quote from her. She says, there is something like frozen thoughts, you know, thoughts that are frozen, that they become like a hard block of ice. And she says, they come so handily that you can use them in your sleep. So some thoughts, they are so frozen that they are like blocks, and you can just use them, you can play with them, you can use them to construct theories, but you don't even have to be awake. You can do it in a sleeping way. But then she said, but if the wind of thinking, which I shall now stir in you, has shaken you from your sleep and made you fully awake and alive, then you will see that you have nothing in your grasp but perplexities. So what she's saying is that the sort of thinking that she wants to do, or that she wants to present, it's like a warm wind that flows over those blocks and makes them melt. So rather than using the blocks in a sort of a construction of a theory and building a big castle or something, it's the opposite. You just stand, you stop, you look backward to the notions that you have been using, and you let a warm wind blow over them so that they melt away. And according to her, what you're then left with, it's just liquid. You know, the block is gone. You just have perplexities, nothing stable anymore. And she says the best you can do is share it with others. I want to do a little bit more than what she says. So I would argue that Zhengming is one of those academic notions that has been used as a sort of a frozen block that people handle even while being, you know, partly asleep. And I would like to invite you to blow a warm wind over it so that it becomes fluent again. And of course, in the first step, you may have the feeling that this only leaves you with perplexities, because everything that was fixed and stable and firm is now melting. It's fluid. But I am convinced that that's not the end. So aside from these perplexities, I think you will discover that in these blocks, there are lots of connections. You know, each block, it's like a knot of various lines of thought. And if you look at it in this way, I think you discover texts that before you did not think were important to look at. You also discover historical backgrounds. You know, if you look at how people discuss Zhengming in different periods in time, you focus on those periods in time and you see how they connect to the visions of Zhengming in those days. You also discover all sorts of textual connections. Who may have influenced whom? So what I present here as, you know, thinking, at least, you know, the way that Hannah Arendt presents it, it's a sort of a reflection. It's backward looking. It's slow. It's not constructing a new theory. And this is, of course, not to say that I think that these constructions of theory are wrong. I don't think they're wrong. I'm just trying to do something else here. So we start with the one dialogue in the Lunyu in which Zhengming occurs. I have it here. I'm sure that most people are extremely familiar with it. I will not translate it because if I start translating it, I'm already making choices as for the interpretation. And that's something I want to avoid here. I don't want to get into debate about how to understand it. So I will just go over the text, but without translating it. So 子路曰，魏征代子而为政，子将西先。And the master says, 必也正名乎? First, Zulu is a bit critical and he asks his teacher, why such a detour? And then the teacher says to his student, you know, yeah, you are really, you're really not very cultivated. If you were cultivated, you would shut up. And then he says the very well-known chain argument, 名不正则言不顺，言不顺则事不成，事不成则礼乐不信，礼乐不信则刑罚不重，刑罚不重则民无所措手足。This is like a chain. If this, then this, if this, then this, if this, then this. And then he concludes also with the very well-known sentences, 故君子明之必可言也，言之必可行也。君子与其言无所苟而已矣。So this is the one statement about Zhengming in the Lunyu. So what am I trying to do now? I will try not only to unfreeze, as Hannah Arendt says, but also to untangle all the connections of how the current modern Zhengming discourse came about. So in other words, the way that nowadays we tend to discuss Zhengming in academia, you know, in our courses, in our articles, in our books, in our textbooks. Where did that come up from? How was this constructed? And what I will first do, I will look at 6 characteristics that I think occur more or less in the contemporary debate. I call them family resemblances following Ludwig Wittgenstein rather than an essence, because I don't think that current debates, they all have these 6 characteristics to the same extent, but more or less, I think these are like the characteristics that are identify the modern character and that differs from the pre-modern way that Zhengming was discussed. Then I will go to Kang Youwei because I think there we find the germs or the beginning of the modern discourse, and then I will go to Hu Shi. As Hu Yuan already said, this is a topic that I studied earlier because I think that Hu Shi, on the one hand, he was influenced by Kang Youwei in what was for himself a very important notion, Zhengming, for Hu Shi. This was really the core of his book, but he never acknowledges Kang Youwei in this respect. He never says in his book, like, you know, this is an idea that I got from Kang Youwei, what I think he did, to some extent at least. And then, of course, I think Hu Shi was very influential on today's discussion of Zhengming, certainly in the West. Of course, there is a wide variety in the West of all sorts of views on Zhengming. I'm certainly not denying this. But there is a sort of a core, I think, that is still influential, even though Hu Shi is often criticized for being too Westernized, and I think rightly so. His influence is much deeper than only that. Even if you take away the so-called Western influence, he has had a lot of influence, which I think is often not acknowledged. So let's begin with the 6 characteristics or the 6 family resemblances. I want to say a few things about them. I call them the resemblances of the modern Zhengming discourse. I would want to invite you not to take this term modern too heavily. You know, I'm not being philosophical about the notion modern. You know, by modern, I basically mean something like the decades before and after the turn of the 20th century. That's what I call modern. Of course, a lot happened in China in those days, historically, politically, and of course also institutionally. You know, the creation of universities, and in the universities, philosophy departments. All this had an influence, of course, on the Zhengming debate. So that's basically what I call modern. What happened in those days in a larger context. So what I'm going to tell now about Zhengming, some people of you will probably say, this is just you could tell the same story about lots of other concepts. And I would totally agree with you. As I did earlier research, for example, on the Maoist Shulun, there also I try to show that the way we talk nowadays about Shulun, as if it's a sort of an immortal concept since Mozi until today, to a large extent, it's really created in that period. Not totally, but to a large extent. So you could do this with many other concepts. So they would have a parallel history to what I will tell you here about Zhengming. It's only that each notion has also its own history. And so I tried today to focus on the notion of Zhengming. And of course, those 6 characteristics are also closely connected to each other. So I try to unravel them and pull them apart, but in reality, it's really difficult to pull them apart. So it will be a bit, awkward, a bit piano, to pull them apart. Of course, what I will say about the modern characteristics of Zhengming, it's not totally unconnected with the past. Obviously not. So many of the things that I will consider modern are similar to the past, but maybe only in a more structured way, in a more stressed way, in a more abundant way than what happened in the past in a more loose and fragmented way. And then finally, what I want to say is that when I talk about this modern Zhengming discourse, of course, I'm not suggesting that nowadays everybody says the same about Zhengming. There is still a wide variety of views. Actually, I believe that the stronger and the more influential is this core, the more it's the basis for a wide variety of views and debates. So this is not contradicting each other. Having said this, I first want to turn to my sources of inspiration so that you know where I come from. In the modern discourse, one of the characteristics is that people write books and articles and chapters on Zhengming. You will see this is one of the characteristics of the modern discourse. So some of the books that are either about Zhengming, or at least they pay a lot of attention to Zhengming. It's a book of 1988 in German on Zhengming by Robert Gassman, then a book by John Maycam, Name and Actuality in Early Chinese Thought in 94, then Chad Hansen, Taoist Theory of Chinese Thought, and then more recently, Jane Gheani, Language and Bodily Practice in Early China. These books are very different. They are also, they have a totally different view on Zhengming, but what they share is, according to me, a sort of a modern interest in Zhengming. And then from those books, I went to some Chinese books. One is by Ting Liang. I did not find online a picture of the cover of his book. Therefore, I give you a picture of the author. The book is titled Wu Ming yu Zhengming, 论中国上中古明明史问题的文化作用与发展. This book is totally dedicated to Zhengming. And the same with the book of Gou Dongfeng of 2016, and then also the book by Cao Feng, which was originally his doctoral dissertation, is also on Zhengming. So those books also, they give a lot of different visions on Zhengming, and in that respect, they are really very rich. Not only did they give me a vision of lots of contemporary secondary insights on Zhengming, but they gave me a vision of lots of primary sources, because these scholars, and certainly the Chinese scholars, they went to the original texts, going from the Lunyu up till today. They also went to the original text and they quoted them. And so I could discover what it is that they would quote when they were discussing Zhengming. So that in that sense, these books were also very useful for me. But having done this, I was wondering, could it be that in the early Chinese texts, there was much more talk about Zhengming than just what these scholars quoted? And therefore, I also tried to check some databases, and I went to CText because that's very easy for us as a database to use. And then I went to some others like Zhonghua Qingdian Guji Ku. And then finally, I found this one. And yeah, I thought this was a very rich one. It's a Diaolong Zhongri Guji Chuanwen Jiansuo Shuji Ku. And it has lots of collectania and the books, the Daozang and the Supu Congkan and the Xu Supu Congkan, and the Suku Chuanshu, and so on and so on. And I tried to collect there what was said about Zhengming explicitly, and that was already a wealth of information. Of course, I have not discussed it all I have not studied it all in detail, so I have many years to continue studying, because I already discovered that here and there are like bubbles of Zhengming interest that certainly for future research would be really interesting to look into. But with all this as a background, this helped me to do my presentation of how I would distinguish pre-modern from modern discussions of Zhengming. And as I said, I have 6 family resemblances, or 6 characteristics, and I will present them here. One characteristic of the modern approach is that the scholars tend to quote the whole dialogue. The dialogue that I just presented to you. There is a tendency in academic works when they discuss Zhengming to quote the whole dialogue for the readers to discuss. If you compare this with the pre-modern situation, there I think this is extremely seldom that the whole dialogue is quoted. Usually it's just parts and pieces. For example, before the Han Dynasty, I think the dialogue is, as far as I know, never quoted as a whole, and extremely seldom a part of it is quoted. I don't think, maybe there are some Guanzi chapters which you don't know whether they are Han or not Han. And of course, there's the Yin Wenzi. If you want to think that this is pre-Han, then you may think, of course, that there is one line from the dialogue that is quoted. But I think Yin Wenzi is post-Han. But anyway, even if you include it, before the Han Dynasty, this dialogue is just basically not quoted, not even parts of it. From the Han Dynasty onwards, it increases more and more and more. So you get an increasing interest in Zhengming and also in the dialogue, but still not very often, and almost never the whole thing. So of course, in this all these databases that I just presented to you, Zhengming occurs extremely often. So it's a topic that is, very often referred to, which is of course not very surprising, since the Chinese tradition has such a huge collection of texts. So many topics would of course occur very often. But if you then go from the expression Zhengming to the dialogue that we are talking about, the dialogue between Zulu and Kongzi, the line that you would sometimes find quoted is 子曰必也证明乎, just this line within one's own argument. Less often, but sometimes quoted, would also be 君子于其言无所苟而已矣, or also 名不正言不顺. This is also occasionally quoted, but then the other lines, extremely seldom. So there is a difference, even though it's only in degree, between the pre-modern texts that almost never quote the whole dialogue and actually only tiny little pieces of it, and then the modern discourse in which the full dialogue is often quoted. So that would be my first characteristic of the modern discourse. The second characteristic would be that there is a very strong insistence that Zhengming is very important. Many scholars would even call it Not all scholars, of course, but many scholars would say that this in a way is the core, or at least one of the core ideas of Confucius thought. I quote some people, somebody says it's a significant aspect of the Luinyu. Somebody else says it occupies an important, if not central position in the political philosophy of Confucius. Somebody else says it's a doctrine underlying, and I quote, all the features of Confucian political theory that make it unique. So you see, it's really important for Confucius, but not only for Confucius. Many scholars will say that it's important for the whole of preaching thought. Like here, it's a preoccupation that marked the entire subsequent development of preaching Chinese thought. And somebody else says, Zhengming was an ongoing topic of controversy, unending for more than 2000 years. So you see, there are statements in academic works that say how very important Zhengming is for Confucius, but also broader for the other scholars. And aside from those statements, you also see that they consider Zhengming important from, you could say, formal characteristics, such as, for example, what I would call paratextual information, the fact that books are written about Zhengming, with Zhengming in the title, or that articles are written about Zhengming, or that within a book, when there is a chapter on Confucius, there would be a subsection within the title Zhengming. So you see also, just by looking at the table of contents or looking at an index, you can tell that Zhengming is important. Even if the person has not even said so, you can just tell from formal characteristics. How does this differ from the pre-modern situation? I think it's very different, but of course not absolutely different. Again, in the pre-modern context, I think all the texts that I have seen, they agree that Zhengming is important, and they also are positive about it. Thus far, I have not seen a text that says, Confucius was wrong with his Zhengming statement. I have not seen that at all. To begin with, the Luinyu dialogue itself, the master says, Biye Zhengming Hu. And I think the most current translation of the statement is that, it's necessary, Zhengming. I know that there are other interpretations, and some scholars translate this like, if you really have to, then okay, Zhengming. In that case, it doesn't really stress the importance, but I think the general interpretation is that this line, at least that's how it's being quoted in the pre-modern tradition, this line shows that, for Confucius, at least in that dialogue, Zhengming is important. And then, as I just said, all the references, they are stressing its importance. And of course, even more so when we go at Luinyu commentaries, and then you have scholars, I think, in the Song and the Ming Dynasty and later, who comment on the dialogue between Zulu and Confucius, they will often elaborate also on its importance. So, of course, in the pre-modern text, it was also important. But there is an important difference of degree between the importance that they attribute to it in the pre-modern text. They are always positive about it. But the importance in the modern text, they are singling out this notion as, very important, crucial, the core of his thinking, the core of all the masters' thinking. I mean, not everybody is saying this, but it's going in that direction. And this, I think, is an important difference of degree. We go to the next one. What you see here is that in the modern texts, there is like a growing set of sayings attributed to Confucius that are all supposed to be about Zhengming. So again, we first look at the modern part. You see like what I call an orbit of the Zhengming topic for Confucius. So as I said earlier, strictly speaking, there is just one statement in the Luinyu, which is about Zhengming. But there is an increasing tendency of scholars to read all sorts of other things that Confucius said, either in the Luinyu or in other texts, and to interpret them in terms of Zhengming. So again, I want to repeat what I said in the very beginning. It's not my intention to criticize this. I do understand that, of course, it's typical for an interpretation to do exactly this. You know, you think that you can explain what's going on. And so you try to get as much as possible textual evidence to make a huge, convincing, elegant hypothesis. So this is what is going on. I'm trying to describe it. So you get in the modern discourse an expanding number of sayings of Confucius that a variety of scholars argues is probably said in the spirit of Zhengming, even though Zhengming is not named there. And what you also get, it's like a clustering of sayings. Like when scholars will mention Zhengming in a chapter or in a section of a chapter, there will be a tendency to quote each other and to repeat again and again and again a clustered set of core sayings of Confucius that are supposedly about Zhengming. And I think the most well-known cluster, aside from the dialogue that we looked at in the beginning, it's Jun Jun Chen Chen Fu Fu Zi Zi and Ku Bu Ku Ku Zai Ku Zai, and also Zheng Zhi Zheng Ye. These are like the statements that very often are presented at the outset when a scholar wants to introduce Zhengming. So here we have not only an expanding of sayings, but also a sort of a clustering of sayings. And it's interesting to see that even those scholars who sometimes have doubts about this dialogue in the Lunyu, and they think maybe this only entered into the Lunyu very late, or maybe they think it's not said by Confucius, the historical person, but it's fake or whatever. Even these scholars, they would sometimes say, you know, this dialogue maybe not be Confucius, but nevertheless, the Lunyu is pretty much about Zhengming. I think Hui Chie Loy of Singapore is an example of this. He doubts the historicity of this dialogue, but nevertheless, he is influenced by this modern discourse to read the Confucius thought in the Lunyu in terms of Zhengming. How does this differ from the pre-modern period? I think in the pre-modern period, of course, once in a while, a quote of Confucius is mentioned when there is talk about Zhengming, certainly. I think the one that occurs most often, it's Jun Jun Chen Chen Fu Fu Zi Zi, especially from the Song dynasty onwards. There is like an explicit connection between the dialogue with Zulu and Jun Jun Chen Chen Fu Fu Zi. They become a cluster. But other sayings are also sometimes mentioned. For example, there is this statement of Confucius in the Zhuozhuan in which he says that we should never give vessels and titles to others. This is not something that you should give away or you should lend to others. And another saying, it's a story that is in many Han texts. It's about Confucius saying that if the ruler wants a horse, this is not borrowing, it's taking. So this is also often connected with Zhengming. And then, of course, Confucius, when he wrote the Chunqiu, and he did this to bring about order and to judge people and to blame and to praise. And so it was to Zheng Qiming. So this also are connections with statements of Confucius, but of course, all this is very much repeated in the modern discourse, but the modern discourse is much more consistent, much more elaborate. I mean, many more sayings of Confucius and much more clustering. So again, it's a difference of degree. It's not an absolute difference. Then we come to the fourth characteristic of the modern discourse, and that is that not only Confucius saying, but lots of other texts are supposedly also discussing Zhengming. And again, there is a difference with the pre-modern situation in the sense that the pre-modern situation, you would also have connections with other expressions that would be explained in terms of Zhengming once in a while. For example, when there is talk about Chengming, there would be scholars who say, this is connected to Zhengming, or of course, Xingming, like for example, in the Hanfeizi, this is connected to Zhengming, or debates on Mingbian, or Mingjiao later, or Mingshi, or Mingfen. I mean, all these topics, once in a while, there would be a scholar who would connect them to Zhengming. Also, when the Chunqiu talks about such topics as regicide, some people would say, this is also a matter of Zhengming. And then also, when you have sentences that are in the shape of Chunchun Chunchun Fufu Zizi, they may have other characters there, like a husband, husbands, a wife, wives, a son, sons, a daughter, daughters, or whatever. You have all sorts of variations. But when this comes up, scholars will maybe say it's about Zhengming. So here in the pre-modern texts, you get a loose set of a variety of topics that when people see them, they might connect it or explain it in terms of Zhengming. What is then the difference with the modern discourse is that all these examples that I just mentioned, they are often repeated, so they are confirmed, but they are also enhanced. Like in the modern discourse, many, many, many more things will be brought up and said to be in relation to Zhengming. And then you will have lots of confusion sources that are quoted being about Zhengming, even though they don't mention Zhengming, or if they do mention Zhengming, they don't mention Confucius, or they certainly don't mention the Lunyu dialogue, but nevertheless, they're all supposed to be about Zhengming. The same with the Neo-Moist passages that are quoted in the context, legalist, Taoist, and so on. So that's the fourth characteristic. You get like an increased set of textual sources that are all used to explain Zhengming. The fifth characteristic is that Zhengming is presented in some sort of as a coherent vision, as a coherent theory. So if you look at the modern context, of course, this is related with the fact that Zhengming ended up in the philosophy departments, and philosophy departments present coherent theories. So Zhengming is then presented as something that each master had like a theory about. Not only Confucius, but maybe also Mencius, and of course Xunzi, and then Yin Wenzi, and Mozi, and everyone had a theory about Zhengming. And among each other, and they connected in lineages with sublineages, and among each other also, they debated about Zhengming. So there was a coherent debate among all these people. That's a sort of a vision you get in a modern discourse. If you go to the pre-modern era, it's much more fragmented. You will have occasional references to Zhengming, but they are very stereotypical. Zhengming is just mentioned, as if everybody knows what it means, and very briefly, and not analyzed, and not in a coherent theory. It will be mentioned when there is a statement about the importance of administration or social order or jurisdiction, punishing and rewarding. But there is really, as I said earlier, little interest in trying to discover what is the coherent theory behind this dialogue that we started out with. There is no attempt to, or very little attempt. It's just used by an author who wants to make a point, and the author already assumes that everyone, likes Zhengming, and so it's used to make another argument. It's a bit like a rhetorical trope. It's not as if one wants to really discover what is the Confucius theory when, presenting this long dialogue. When in commentaries, there is reflection on this dialogue, which of course also happens, then very often it's talk about this succession issue in the State of Wei. Not always, but very often. So in the State of Wei, where Confucius visited his disciple Zulu, and Zulu was working for Duke Chu, and Duke Chu was on the throne, and he did not allow his father to return to Wei and to take over the throne, and his father had fled because his father had tried to kill his stepmother who had an affair. You know, the whole historical background. Very often it's about this when commentators try to make a coherent story about this dialogue. So this is very different, I think, from the sort of increasing tendencies to make big stories and theoretical debates of Zhengming. And then the last characteristic, for me, it's the most difficult one. It's a bit different from all the others. And that is that, on the one hand, I think that the Zhengming debates today are really, you know, the modern Zhengming debates are a break from the past. But at the same time, they insist very much that they are the real past, that they, for the first time, interpret the past the way it really was. So you get, on the one hand, a fracture, a break, but again, also a restoration. And then they select those statements, you know, from the past texts that support their reading of Zhengming. So it's very difficult to say, is it a break with the past or is it in line with the past? Because it's both. It breaks. It's a very explicit new interpretation of Zhengming. That's typical for the modern discourse. But this new interpretation insists on the fact that it's really old, that it's really founded on, you know, original texts. And so this differs in a way that I still have not really been able to characterize very well. But I think in the pre-modern texts, Zhengming is very familiar. And it, of course, it's used in all sorts of debates, but it's not standing out as something that breaks with the frame. It fits in the frame, which is usually Ru, but not always exclusively Ru. So that's the sixth characteristic. It's the most difficult one. So just to repeat the 6 characteristics of modern Zhengming discourse. First, the dialogue is quoted fully. There is a great insistence on how important it is. There is a tendency to bring in lots of Confucius sayings that are supposedly about Zhengming. There is also a tendency to bring in lots of other texts that are also supposedly about Zhengming. There is an attempt to turn everything into coherent narratives, and there is a break with the past, which is then also restored. So these are the characteristics. And so now my point is, and then we turn to Kang Youwei, that I think that this set of characteristics, which are present, you know, more or less in most of the modern presentations. Of course, not all of these characteristics to the same degree. I mean, there is some variation. I think that some of the characteristics begin with Kang Youwei. I mean, this change from the pre-modern to the modern situation began with Kang Youwei, but not in all of his work. I think in most of his work, Kang Youwei is still very much in line with the tradition. Where is it that I find that something is becoming a bit different? It's when he is talking about Kongzi Gaizhikao. So I will basically focus on that book and also on the lecture notes that were made by his students around in the 90s when he was teaching about this. So that will be my focus. And so for each characteristic, I will try to show how Kang Youwei is sometimes pre-modern, but sometimes he seems to be doing things that we would now consider modern. So if we go to the full quote, he will sometimes quote other books that quote a little piece of the dialogue. And then, of course, in those cases, he would just quote exactly the same little piece of the dialogue. For example, if he quotes Ian Wunzer or he quotes Chunqiu Fan Lu, and they quote a little part of the dialogue, he quotes the same because he's quoting them. But when he is making his own argument and he wants to say something, then he quotes twice at least in the Kongzi Gaizhikao the whole dialogue. He does this one in a section that he's talking about how Confucius creates rujiao, to change the system, to reform the system. And he is in a debate with his disciples about the ta'i of the kaizhi. And then a bit further, he also does this when he gets response from students who disagree, in this case, Zelu, who thinks that his teacher is taking a detour, and then he is defending it. So in both cases, you get the full dialogue, because, the book Kongzi Gaizhi Kao, many of you probably know this, it's to a large extent, it's just quotes from early texts that are collected by Kang Youwei's students, and then he picked them out and he made his argument. So he structured it, he made his titles, and sometimes there are some comments by him. So, but here, very often it's the focus is on the quotes. And so you have the two full quotes of the dialogue. If we then go to the second characteristic, he insists, at least within these sections of Kongzi Gaizhi Kao, he really insists that Zhengming for Confucius is important. He says that when Confucius tried to reform the system, he xian Zhengming. When the sage he ordered the world, he xian Zhengming. And he also says that there was a debate going on and everyone did something else. But Confucius, was really worried about all these different views. And so in reforming the system, he considered Zhengming the first. So you see there was a lot of stress on Zhengming here. Of course, aside from this, in other contexts, Kang Youwei uses Zhengming in a wide variety of meanings, but I'm not focusing on those now. I mean, these are more pre-modern, I think, or something to be discussed later. He discusses Zhengming when he's talking about dialects versus national language, sometimes when he's talking about the script, sometimes when he's talking about posthumous names in political arguments, and so on. What's also interesting, and it's pre-modern, it's not what I identified with the modern characteristic, is that what you do not see in Kongzi Gaizhi Kao yet are titles, or let's say a table of content that would give you an impression that he's interested in Zhengming. They are never in the title. Zhengming is not in the title. So that's a second characteristic. The third characteristic, as I said, was a sort of a growing orbit of Confucius statements. And here I think he is still largely pre-modern, in the sense that in his Kongzi Gaizhi Kao, and especially those sections where he's really focusing on Zhengming, he does not quote the Lunyu. So there is no statement, nor any other statement that is explicitly attributed to Kongzi. Not even Jun Jun Chen Chen Fu Fu Zi Zi. While, Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming, they did. When they discussed Zhengming, they would refer to those two. Kang Youwei, in other contexts, does refer to Jun Jun Chen Chen Fu Fu Zi when he's talking about how important it is to Zhengming, but that's like more in the loose variety of everything he says once in a while. But here in this context of Kongzi Gaizhi Kao, he does not. And I think this is related to the fact, perhaps, that for Kang Youwei, the Lunyu was not really the most representative text for Confucius. He thought that, we could get to know Confucius better if we would read the authentic Shi and Shu and Yi and Li. And of course the Trincio, because the Trincio were Confucius' own words, and the others were like created by Confucius, tuoku, to attribute to the past his vision of reform. So in this sense, he's still not modern, I think. But in the following sense, the fourth characteristic, he is beginning what later became the modern discourse, in the sense that he brings in other texts that, according to him, are all about Zhengming. And one set of texts that he brings in, it's what he considers all sorts of Moist text, or at least following Mozi, of course, what we would now call the Mo Bian, but also Kun Sun Long, Hui Shi, Deng Xizi, and so on. So he quotes, or he refers to these texts. He does not quote them, and he's saying they're all about Zhengming. They debate Zhengming. It's interesting that at this point he does not enter any Taoist text explicitly in his debate on Zhengming. Of course, broader in the whole Kongzi Gaizhikao, there's lots of quotes, and lots of them are related to Ming, and certainly also from Taoist texts. But there in the sections that he's trying to make his point about, how important Zhengming is, he refers to what he considers Maoists. Kun Long even has really a special position in his eyes, because in other places in his work also, he would sometimes associate Kun Long exclusively with Zhengming. Even, for example, in the preface of his Lun Yu Zhu, he says Kun Long is about Zhengming. So there is a strong association with these texts and Zhengming. He also says that, the Chunqiu Zhengming Fen and Wang Zhi, so the chapter of the Li Ji, it's also about Zhengming, more specifically in juridical cases about punishing. He does not give any quotes there, which is understandable, because these texts never mention Zhengming. And then he also says that Xunzi Zhengming chapter and Dongzhong Shu, Shencha Minhao, that they are the ones that really got the great meaning that Confucius had hidden in his subtle words, both in the Lun Yu and in the Chunqiu. So these guys, they responded to Confucius, but they were wrong. But these guys, they responded to Confucius and they were right. And here he refers to them pretty often. So you have the feeling that this is like his cluster that he repeats again and again when he's talking about Zhengming. In the case of Xunzi, of course, it's not difficult because there is the Zhengming chapter. And the lines that he quotes most often, also in his Lun Yu Zhu, when he is discussing the dialogue with Zilu, it's the line in the beginning of this chapter in which it's said that, Zhengming is used for punishments, for ranks, for rights, and for customs. We have to know, of course, that the Zhengming chapter itself never refers to Confucius nor to the Lun Yu, but nevertheless, for Kang Youwei, this line and some other lines of the chapter, belong to the core of his Zhengming textual support. And another one is a little bit more complicated. He refers here to a chapter in the Chunqiu Fan Lu. This chapter, Shencha Minhao, is together with the following chapter, Shixing. Originally, that was like one essay. And this one essay was about a debate about human nature between Xunzi and Mencius. And Dongzhong Shu is here siding with Xunzi. So in Kang Youwei's discussion of reforming the system, he's not quoting this chapter because this chapter is not relevant for quoting. It's not about reforming the system. It's about the nature of human nature. But he's nevertheless referring to it, at least to the title, and saying that Dongzhong Shu was so right, because as we can see in other parts of Kang Youwei's work, he finds it very important because this chapter here does quote the Guliang Zhuan. And the Guliang Zhuan is one of the very few books that do quote the dialogue, at least one sentence from the dialogue between Confucius and Zilu, in which it says that, you can tell from the Chunqiu that the gentleman is never careless with his choice of words, which comes from the dialogue. It is in a record of something that happened under Duke Xi, the 16th year. There were 5 falling stones from the sky, and there were 6 backward flying hawks over the capital of Song. And so the Guliang Zhuan is explaining that, the way that this is phrased is a wonderful case of Zhengming. And so the Chunqiu Fan Lu is copying this. And so Kang Youwei also agrees with this and finds this a great example of Zhengming. But he does not quote it here, I think, because it's not relevant for Gaizhi, changing the system. The 5th one then is the theoretical coherent visions that are presented. I think that you could divide Kang Youwei's argument in 3 sorts of emerging theoretical debates. And the first is that when he talks about Zhengming, he tries to show how many masters were really all discussing Zhengming. For example, lots of masters who were following Mozi were interested in Zhengming. And even he would say that Xingming originally came from Lao Tzu. He says this in another part of the book. So not where he's really quoting the Lunyu dialogue, but you see that he sees that many rivals are talking about Zhengming. Of course, they're all wrong. I mean, Confucius was right, they were wrong, but nevertheless, they are important because they show that, you know, Zhengming is a topic that people are interested in. Even though most of those books don't mention Zhengming, but nevertheless, in this interpretation, they become part of a larger theoretical debate. Then if we move from the Han to the Qing dynasty, then Kang Youwei's story is that due to the, you know, boycott of Liu Xin, it was forgotten that Kongzi was really the sage, you know, the uncrowned king who, by the choice of his words in the Chunqiu, he actually really corrected the names of, you know, China. It was forgotten, people didn't know it anymore, but in reality, Kang Youwei says, you know, up till today, all the names that we have were actually corrected by Kongzi. So this is the second part of the story, that despite, you know, what Liu Xin tried to do, and Liu Xin tried to, you know, defend the fake old texts, and so that the authentic new texts were forgotten, the reality is still that the social reality is that we are really indebted to Kongzi's Zhengming. So that's the second story. And then the last one would be Kang Youwei's own time, that he sees himself as, you know, the person who takes up the job that Confucius had done, but that was somehow obstructed by Liu Xin and his followers. One of his own sobriquets is even Chang Su, you know, the person who is going beyond or is superior to the Su Wang. And so what you do see that Kang Youwei does, not in Kongzi Kaizhikao, but in many later texts like letters or memoranda, he is often Zhengming himself. He uses Zhengming in an argument. For example, when he's trying to say that we should not listen to the Dowager Empress, he says, if we Zhengming, she's not a mother of the current young Guangxu emperor. And if we Zhengming, we have to know that what she's trying to do is Chuanwei, and it's Tao Zei. And if we don't support the young emperor, we will have to Zhengming that what happens is Shi, regicide. He's even talking about the Europeans who Zhengming the term Shi, market. And he's also saying that the Europeans and the Americans, they are wrong about the terms Kung He and Zhuanzhi, and so we have to Zhengming them. So he himself is very much taking part in, you know, what he thinks Confucius did in his eyes, and he is taking this up. So these are three levels in which I think Zhengming is part of a sort of a larger coherent vision. Having said this, these three are still far apart from what we will later see in a few minutes. That's what the modern discourse does. That's really focusing on Zhengming itself and writing a whole article or a whole book about the topic of Zhengming. That's not what he does yet. So now we go to the last characteristic, and that's the fracture and the restoration. And here I think you can see how closely the two are connected, because the more novel Kang Youwei's ideas are, and I think we all agree that they're very novel, they were very novel, the more he insists that they are old, that they are the real authentic past. So therefore, it's very difficult to distinguish between what is modern and what is pre-modern, because it's characteristic of the modern view to insist that it is in line with the past. So this is the point I'm trying to make here. It's new, of course, but he also, what I think is characteristic here for some the modern debate is that more and more the voice of the author, in this case Kang, is becoming more and more important, and the quotes are becoming more and more illustrations. But he making his argument with the structure of the argument, with titles, this is becoming more and more important, I think. But still, Kongzakajikao is a lot of quotes, and sometimes with very short comments of Kang Youwei. So it's somewhere in between. The pre-modern characteristics of his work is still, I think, that Ru is the uncontested frame. So he's not using Zhengming to defend the Ru against something else. No, it's a debate within the Ru tradition. It's within that tradition that he will defend one strand, the Gongyang tradition and the New Text School, against others, but within the Ru tradition. In that sense, it's still pre-modern. There's no attempt to defend the whole Chinese tradition against the West. Okay, so what do I think are the typical modern characteristics of Kang Youwei's presentation of Zhengming in the Kongzakajikao? First, it's that he quotes the dialogue fully. Secondly, that he tries to bring in a lot of other texts that, according to him, are about Zhengming, but not from the Lunyu. And he also organizes all the others in masters and lineages and sub-lineages. So I think that tendency is, of course, it existed in the past, but it became much more important with Kang Youwei. And what you also see is that there is not much evidence in the early texts, and so he has to handle this. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why he quotes Xunzi, because Xunzi happens to have a chapter on Zhengming, even though it never refers to Kongzi nor to the dialogue, but at least it's a chapter on Zhengming. And although Kang Youwei prefers Mencius, he quotes Xunzi here because, there is material to quote. And the same with this Guliang commentary in the Gongyang Zhuan. I think for Gaizhi, it's useless, but it's one of the very few instances where Zhengming is mentioned or where the dialogue is mentioned. Unfortunately, Gongyang Zhuan never refers to Zhengming, nor does the Chunqiu, but the Guliang Zhuan does, and it's being picked up in the Chunqiu Fanlu, and so he quotes it. So the little few things that he have to be collected to be taken into the larger topic. And then we go to the last one, and that's Hu Shi. And here again, I will focus on his dissertation, which he wrote with John Dewey in the States, and he later published. And according to himself, he published it without making hardly any changes at all. But he did make changes in the Chinese version of his book, 中国哲学史大纲. So that's something that he really enhanced and changed, having talked to colleagues and friends. So I'm trying to focus on the two books in my research, and I basically want to see to what extent I think he was influenced by Kang Youwei, or maybe no direct line of influence, but at least where you see that they belong to the same sort of modern atmosphere. And here I'm following Zhao Litong, who wrote an article to say that maybe Hu Shi was more influenced by Kang Youwei than he himself admitted. What I want to do here is something similar, but I want to focus on Zhengming, not on all sorts of other texts or topics. And I want to also include the English publication, which Zhao Litong does not do. He focuses on the Chinese publication. But aside from that, my inspiration is very much from his work.